Welcome to C5 Population Ecology, and we are going to be looking at a couple of population growth models in this screencast. So it's the first three questions here. So we're going to be looking at essentially what are the factors that impact population, and then there are a couple of population models that we need to be able to look at. One is exponential growth, and one is the logistic growth curve. Okay, so let's take a look at these models. And essentially, there's two population growth models. There's an exponential growth model and a logistic growth model. And depending on the life history of a species, how many offspring it tends to have, how quickly they can reproduce, how long-lived they are, will often determine which of these two population growth models that it tends to follow. So first, we're going to look at exponential growth. So the idea of exponential growth is that the population growth is going to keep increasing by a larger amount every year. It's not going to be adding the same amount of individuals every year. The amount of growth, like how much bigger it's getting, is going to get bigger every year. And we end up getting a J-shaped curve. And species that exhibit this type of growth, we talk about them as R-selected species because their growth rates are super close to their biotic potential. So it's like they have all the things they need. They've got all the resources, the food, the water, the shelter that they need. There's nothing keeping them. Waste products aren't limiting them. They're not polluting themselves out. They're good to go. And so they can reproduce at what we call their biotic potential as fast as they possibly can. So the exponential growth model, again, it's when it's at its fastest rate possible, ideal circumstances, it's got all the mates that it needs, everything it possibly needs. There's no restrictions on its ability to grow, and it can just grow by an ever increasing amount every year. This is looking at bacterial cells in a culture, and you can see how quickly it goes from one bacterial cell all the way to 2 to the 36th, right? So 68 billion cells within 12 hours if they can reproduce exponentially every 20 minutes. So that can happen really fast. So it's getting faster and faster. The rate of growth gets faster and faster every reproduction cycle. But okay, so obviously species aren't going to go on forever and keep reproducing because that would take over the planet pretty quickly. And so if you're an R-selected species, one that does reproduce really quickly at these fast rates, they tend to hit some sort of crash. One, their food supply just might disappear and then the population crashes. Toxic waste can start to build up. They pollute themselves out. You could have increased disease, or there could be a major shift in abiotic factors. So when we're looking at successional models, you know how each kind of successional community would take over on the next one. The pioneer species tend to be R-selected species. They grow really quick under their ideal circumstances, but then they tend to crash because those abiotic factors tend to shift pretty quickly, and then they can't come back because the environment has been altered too much. But a lot of the species that we would be looking at too follow this logistic growth curve. So that's the second curve. So here's the exponential curve, but a lot of species tend to level out. We call these guys K-selected species because they tend to hover around something called carrying capacity that we represent with a K. So populations tend to have limits. And what happens is they get more dense, right? Resources start to become scarce. We start to get some competition over resources. And if they're not unlimited, then the population can't grow exponentially for long. So it'll grow exponentially for a while until, all of a sudden there's some resources that we now have to share because the population is so much bigger. And if they have to share those resources, then they can't reproduce as quickly because they don't have enough resources, or some individuals might die because they're not getting enough nutrients or water, whatever that is. So this idea of carrying capacity is an important term. This is the maximum stable population that a particular environment can support sustainably over a long period of time. And so here's carrying capacity, and the population tends to grow. It starts to slow down, and then it hits carrying capacity, and really it can't get much bigger because that population can only be sustainably supported for a long period of time around this carrying capacity. It might shoot past it, but then obviously not enough resources. Individuals might die back. It might go below. And then, so it could fluctuate around it. But in general, the stable population will be the carrying capacity. And carrying capacity depends on the species and the location, right? So if we're looking at the deer in the forest in Devokasharka, then there's only so many resources, so much space, so much food for them to eat. And so there's going to be a limit to how many can be sustainably supported in that forest. So that's in the Devokasharka. But if we went to another forest, maybe one that's much, much bigger in, kind of the remote wilds in northern Czech Republic, we might find deer populations that have a larger carrying capacity because there's more resources available. Maybe there's more room. So that carrying capacity is dependent on the population, what type of species it is, and the location. The same location, right? The Devokasharka might be able to house, a few hundred deer, but maybe it can only house, 50 wild boar, because the wild boar might need more resources. So there's only so many resources in that area of Devokasharka. So the type of species it is will also change what that carrying capacity might be. And of course, carrying capacity in general, the whole idea of it is that it's resulting from something called density dependent limiting factors. So density dependent means that these limiting factors, they aren't a factor for a while. Like, they're still there. Of course, there's only so much food, water, shelter, space, but nobody feels it down here because there's plenty to go around. But once the population gets pretty big, then all of a sudden there's not enough to go around. So they start to slow down. So these factors come into play when the density gets really big. So they're called density dependent limiting factors. Okay, so logistic growth, again, the equation results in this S-shaped curve. Here we're looking at paramecium in a petri dish or in a Erlenmeyer flask. And so it kind of tends to be a little bit low at the beginning, goes up, and then levels out. So we kind of describe it as an S-shaped curve. And the population reaches carrying capacity, it's going to level off. So if you were to estimate the carrying capacity of the paramecium in this flask, you would go and you would say, oh, it looks like it's about, and you would use your ruler, of course. Oh, maybe it's like almost 900, right? So that would be the carrying capacity here. And so you see they're actually kind of fluctuating around it, but essentially the maximum stable population that flask can hold is about 900 paramecium, okay? And they reach carrying capacity, it looks like, just after 10 days, okay? Okay, so you need to be able to kind of talk your way through the different phases of the exponential growth curve. So I'm going to show you all the things involved here. And when you're doing this, you have to consider natality and mortality. So actually, I'm going to take you back to this slide here. This slide is showing you, here's the factors that we're going to pay attention to when we're looking at population growth. Birth and death, birth minus death. So the more births, right, the more population growth, and the deaths would lower population growth. And you've got things such as immigration and emigration. The ones we're going to pay attention to with the logistic growth curve is just birth and death. But essentially, you realize if something immigrates in, it's also a new member of the population. If it emigrates out, it's also leaving the population, similarly to death. So we're going to be looking at birth and death rates when we look at the population growth curve. So I just show you one more time this idea of birth, death, immigration, emigration. Births add to the population, immigration adds to the population, but deaths will decrease the population, where emigration, leaving, would also decrease the population. So that's why we kind of have this little equation here: birth minus deaths plus immigration minus emigration. Okay, so we're going to really be focusing on natality, births, and mortality, immigration. Okay, or sorry, births and deaths. So natality and mortality. Immigration is not mortality. Okay, so let me take you back to our steps in the curve. And for each one of these phases, when we go through them, what I need you to try to focus on is births and deaths, like how, what is natality versus mortality, and how that might result in population growth or not. So in the beginning, there's little or no natality. This is the adjustment period. So let's say you've got kind of a new environment. Maybe it's a pioneer species moving in. The species, as they start to colonize, there's an adjustment phase. Maybe they have to figure out what there is available to eat, and so on. So there's usually little or no natality. So not a lot of births at first. But then once they settle in, then you get this exponential growth phase. And what happens here is that the population is going to be exponentially growing because natality is super high and mortality is low because there's plenty of resources for everybody to eat. So individuals aren't just dying. They're actually, they have plenty of food, water, shelter, space. So in exponential growth, you have very high natality and very low mortality. So high and low. And there's a big difference between the two, which gives us this giant boom for exponential growth. But all of a sudden, it gets to a point where, all of a sudden, resources become a little bit more limited. And so then what happens is if there's not quite enough resources, then natality is going to decrease. Not quite as many babies are going to be born because there's just not enough food to maybe make sure that the individuals can have enough energy to have offspring. And so natality is going to decrease, but it's still more is going to be born than dies because look, it's still growing. The population is still growing. So that means there is more births than there are deaths. But it's slowing down because the big differences, the big high and low, right? Like, so before in exponential growth phase, if you can see me down in the corner here, in exponential growth, natality was really high, mortality was really low. So there's a big difference between the two. So you had a really high, fast growth rate. Well, now what's happening is you're starting to get natality is still higher than mortality, but they're a little bit closer together. So the population is still growing, but not as quickly as it was during exponential. This is called the linear growth phase or transitional phase. And then finally, we get the plateau phase, which is carrying capacity. And that's when natality and mortality are about equal. Okay, so they're going to just, they might do a little bit of this and that. And that means that the nutrient supply and the waste products aren't going to support growth in numbers. So here I'm mentioning waste products. So that's also an important part with carrying capacity. You've got to have enough food, water, shelter, space, but you also have to be able to deal with your waste products. And so you can pollute yourself out, which, as you know, humans might be doing right now when we think about climate change. Okay, so logistic growth, the big picture. Increasing population density reduces resources available, okay, for individual organisms. And so if you're going to have fewer resources, then you're ultimately going to limit the population growth. And the logistic growth model is going to depend on intraspecific competition, so individuals within the same species that are competing, and those density dependent limiting factors, okay? And you need to make sure that you can go through and talk about these phases, and talk about natality and mortality, so birth and deaths, and how they affect growth and what's going on at each of them. Okay, so one last thing I'm going to talk about in this video has to do with limiting factors that they can be top down or bottom up. So things that affect population growth might be bottom up, and that's mostly what we've been kind of talking about at this point. I've been mentioning, food, water, shelter, space. It's the availability of resources, but there are something actually called top down, and that's usually predation. So if there's a lot of predators, it can keep the population low as well. So it can keep that carrying capacity lower because there's a lot of predators that are going to be eating any extra individuals. So, and keystone species often exert a top-down influence on its community. So if you think about the sea star example with that keystone species, that sea star would keep the mussel population low because it was feeding on it, so it couldn't just take over and monopolize all the resources for the other organisms. So bottom-up factors are ones like food, water, shelter, space, where top-down is usually some sort of predation keeping the population low. And the example that you need to know is with algae on a coral reef. There's some species of algae that tend to grow on coral reefs. It's actually not that great for the coral, but the population can stay in check from both top down. So predators, there's a lot of fish like parrotfish and other things that'll munch on that algae and keep it all clean. But another thing that keeps it from growing out of control is if you have limiting nutrients. So if there's not a whole lot of nitrates and phosphates in the water, the population can stay actually pretty low. So, but if you take, so algae and coral reefs, they got low amounts of nutrients. So they tend to live, like in a pretty small box, right? And the parrotfish will put the lid on that box. So the bottom of the box, there's not too many of them because you don't have a lot of nutrients, and there's also a lot of parrotfish that will eat them. Okay, so top down, bottom up controls. But if you take the lid off, if you fish out all the predators, you take away the fish, then all of a sudden they can start growing really fast. If you add a bunch of nutrients, also put nutrients into the water, then you take the bottom out and the population can essentially explode because there's nothing keeping the population down here, and you're supplying it enough nutrients so it can increase its carrying capacity and just go crazy. You should be able to kind of think about what are all those things that oops, I'm going to try to just show you this one particular picture here. You don't need to know it in quite this detail, but this is kind of showing you different things that can affect that algae, right? So in this case, there's Daphnia is an herbivore that eats the algae, and that's a top-down control. So the more Daphnia, the more algae there is. And normally there's not a lot of algae or a lot of nutrients, and so it's fine. But if you get a bunch put in there, then it can grow more too. And so you can kind of think about the way different individuals in a food chain might affect the algae. If you have things that eat the Daphnia, then that increase or decreases the Daphnia population, which could increase the algae population. So there's all these different, kind of pluses and minuses. Like if you introduce things that will eat the things that eat the Daphnia, then there's going to be more Daphnia and less algae, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of like play around with what's going to affect how much there's going to be. All right, so I think that kind of takes care of some of our population growth models.